So maybe I start from my point of view because I just want to experience performance as a white card. I do not read about performer and I do not read about the artist if I have such a possibility. To be able to experience your message straight from you to me as an audience member. And my first question, or just I want to start with this, I had a feeling that you start with the that you or the performers, maybe not you, but the performers were a prisoner of their own limitations at the very beginning, and they are trying to do something with this and trying to find their freedom, and at the end they have freedom, but they don't know what to do with it. So what was the first limitation you wanted to go over, you wanted to go through in your work?
There's many reasons why we start with the first violence, let's say. Actually, from the beginning it came from, because we've been dealing a lot with language and how language can be violent in terms of how it kind of projects limits for the subject in terms of how it becomes embodied. So it's kind of an embodied language. And so we were actually working with this kidnapping thing because we're also somehow kidnapped by the language. I feel, we can break free perhaps in ways of becoming more poetic or things like this. So, and then I think the limitation, the easy limitation is, of course, we've been working with the symbol of the hands behind, and then some of the, let's say, transformations or movements that they go through are, I would say, symbols of bodies that has been exposed to lots of violence, so like cripples or even like these military kind of positions, or and then as well it's dealing with this also with sound more and more. So some kind of audio awareness, and from there building a language. For me, in a way, I think the most important thing is that we don't show who is doing the language, the violence.
The violence.
Yeah, so that it's kind of an invisible. There's an invisible violent actor, so that the audience can kind of project or decide themselves what type of thing that could be violent.
This is the simple image, the simplest image, the beginning image that we can see in the news every day.
Yeah.
That kind of image. But I just want to dig in it. I didn't ask about this kind of image, about your limitation. You said about the language, and what else? The movement patterns.
Yeah, I think the piece goes through lots of different types of limits. Let's say you could say it almost proposes different types of violence, let's say. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but it could of course be movements. It could be gender that limits how the body can move. It can be ways of behaving in between each other. It could be a power play. It could be in the aim of communicating. It can also be a certain type of limitation, like they never really get a language. Choreography can also be a specific limitation, both as a social choreography, but also as me as a choreographer somehow also controlling them. That's why I come down with the words from the technological type of limitations. I would say in the piece we're trying to show loads of different types of limitations or violence.
But limitation, it's not always
a bad thing, no.
Making us a victim.
No.
Sometimes it's very useful. So how do you use this limitation to open yourself or your dancers to the new language? You said the language is a limitation, but you can find another language, or to widen your language, make it wider.
I think it's all types of limits or borders helps us, of course, to become more specific in terms of methodology, for example. And as soon as you have some kind of line, I would say in general it's perhaps easier to be creative or do an act of freedom if you have some type of line to transgress. So, I mean, you can both work the limit, and I agree with that, and we try to do that, right? I mean, in the research, I think also dance is somehow the type of freedom act that could also transgress choreography. So, in that sense, I would say that dance is then somehow the movement of freedom, you know, that can kind of break the boundaries of choreography. So,
yeah. We also say sometimes that the dance is the language which doesn't need to be translated.
Mm-hmm.
So somehow we do not have this limitation of the language as itself.
No, but I do think we have in dance choreography with all its heritage has developed in a way that is as well as strong as a language in terms of how it reduces maybe our ideas of movement. So I would say the traditional choreography could be both in terms of how we can, you know, move in this type of space or how you and I can move right now, but it can also be in terms of, in traditional choreography, we also have, you know, rules or ideas of what type of movements are better or should be performed in a certain way or with what type of technique. And this is also, I would say, similar to the spoken language. Of course, we always have the freedom. I'm not a super pessimist. I'm just saying that we could be as careful about thinking about the regime of choreography as the regime of the spoken language. And I think dance today has gone that far, and especially in terms of how education looks in Sweden, for example. The body is very strongly disciplined and choreographed still, you know. So there's not so much, I would say, like the schools are not practicing freedom of movement really. But
so this is the very strong tradition of Birgit Kullberg in Sweden, or?
Yeah, well, I think we have lots of different ones. Of course, we have all the ones that I would say many dance schools in let's say maybe Western Europe have. No, I mean, you have the strong tradition of the ballet training, even though it's a contemporary education. You have all the modern techniques, and of course, each country have perhaps their big choreographers, where Birgit Kullberg would be one of the Swedish ones, right? So, and they help us, of course, in a way to know what dance possibly could be. But it's also easy that it limits. I mean, if it would only be like, this is one suggestion, then I think I would be very fine with it. But I think it's very easy that it becomes, this is the suggestion, or this is what we should aim for. And at that point, it also becomes a problem, I think. So, but still, I mean, I do use it, you know. I use social language, I use lots of dance tradition within my choreography, as you can see. So it's not that I'm completely against it. I think it's more like, how can we play with it? How can we be careful with it? How can we be problematic for it? How can we?
Do you think that we are now more free having this tradition?
No. Good question. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. It would be interesting perhaps to discuss it with someone then that would be, you know, somehow if you could talk with someone that had a completely different experience, maybe. I don't know. But I think in one sense it's also like I find that as soon as someone breaks the line, right, which is great, and we all get happy and something new happens and it's an act of freedom, that very fast becomes a part of the machine also. So like we cannot really break it in the same way as we did 10 years ago. No? We constantly needs to break it in new ways. So it's the breaking that is the important. So in one way, you could say that we have to be even more creative today, you know? Because we have a heritage of so many people that have been doing great changes. Yeah, you know? So how do we break the stick for the 200th time in a new way, you know? But it makes it maybe also more fun, you know? Or we have a bigger toolbox today. We have perhaps even more methodologies that we can use in that sense.
I was also coming back to the piece. I was also thinking about the relation, from one side, about the relation between performers, which happens very rarely during the piece. and on the other side about the relation performer-audience members, which is shifting, which is you are playing with it, and you are changing the sides, and yeah, we are going through all these moods, which this clapping scene it's very funny, but it speaks so many about our moods and about the mood of performer. So could you please tell, because it's duet, only two person on the stage, 1 hour. So why do you put this limitation between them, that only few times they meet, they touch each other?
Oh, that's a good question. Why do they? Well, I mean, I would guess that it depends. It depends on the different. I mean, I'm not sure if I want to call them scenes, but whatever we call them, the different parts of the performance is suggesting different things, and because of that, I would say, hopefully, we have thought through why they do what they do together. You know, so like in terms of the kind of the irony with the cliche of the female gesture, it's the only part that is in unison, for example, because it's also like kind of the unison, all the women on the world kind of feeling. And so then that was the reason for that, and then.
And the tiny parts, just doing for the audience to be, that they want to be, and the tiny parts where they are doing something to be appreciated, to I don't know how to say it in English, to be liked, to be nice and feminine as well. No, and then I think I mean, of course, there's sometimes where they perhaps are not interacting so much, but they are watching each other. For example, we have this part that we call we call it the semiotic flicker. It doesn't matter if the audience knows that or not, but it's like we've been throwing words onto them, and then they have to do gestures for all the words, like in a kind of super high speed, and then we've been working with this material. And then actually they're trying to read each other. They're not touching, they're not interacting. Maybe, well, they do for a short while in that section as well, before they join in the kind of romantic 70s duo. No? But then it's talking about the lonely. So, I mean, I think I'm interested of this contradictions, maybe, or this double sides always within the message, or the different concepts, perhaps, but... Because they are conscious of themselves. They are all the time. They are very. Yes, this is not my mother language. They are very not open, but come on, wrażliwy. I don't know, sensitive for each other, and they are listen to each other, even though they do not look at each other. But it's also a kind of competition in between them. They are copying each other, but they wanted to do something better or quicker or nicer or prettier or.
I mean, I think for me it's also like many times they do try out similar things together, but they are trying to relate to you as an audience. So maybe then you don't feel that they are so connected, but they, like for example, when they're trying out different gestures, like what could this gesture mean, kind of, or what could this gesture become? And then there's of course a bigger competition in between the two of them, but they are kind of in a friendly or wanting an encounter with the audience. So, but I mean, we've been trying to play with this, of course, and it's perhaps important to say also the two dancers, it's really like we did the piece really together. They just needed to shower because they wanted to see the next show. So otherwise they would love to sit there and talk as well. But and I think they are quite different from each other in the way they take on things as well, and so there's a certain interaction in that as well, I think, and especially maybe because they do sense each other really well, because they've been working together for a long time. But yeah, I mean, I haven't really thought about it, that there's not so much like face-to-face touching interaction.
So I just want to open this discussion just to just few more questions, two questions. Yes, Alexa.
Where are you dancers?
Sorry.
Where are you dancers?
The dancers are changing. They wanted to be here, but they also really wanted to see the next show. So
Because it looked like on stage they were on their own. You were director, but you went out very fast, and so they were without director.
Yeah.
And even in the end, light designer was left, so they were completely on their own.
yeah.
Whereas we don't.
They disappeared. Yeah, I mean, of course, it's been actually a thing when we've been doing this type of talks. Me playing the role of me, but as the bad version, somehow has been a thing we've been discussing a lot, and lots of people has been quite critical about it. And I think maybe because the three of us actually, even though it doesn't seem so once again, but we're so super tight, so we're also, because for me it was also important to kind of, when dealing with, when giving all of these examples of all the things that could be violent or restricted, I didn't want to take away the choreographer from that, you know, from responsibility. And this is the reason why we use me as, you know, some kind of enemy or whatever, in the same way as they do as well. They lend themselves. We all lend ourselves within the project, right?
And the last question, because we wanted the artists are ready. The last question. Okay, so the last question will be the first question of the another discussion.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.